Patrisse Cullors is a Marxist. All right, y'all. I mean, let's just talk about it. Am I a Marxist? I'm a lot of things. I do believe in Marxism. It's a philosophy that I learned really early on in my organizing career.
This is December 15th, 2020, and interestingly, part of the political context for this announcement, which comes as no surprise to those of us who have been following the political history of Black Lives Matter closely, is that The Economist magazine published their estimate that total donations to Black Lives Matter causes exceeds $10 billion US dollars. That does not mean that this particular activist has $10 billion at her disposal. It does not mean that any one agency or organization received $10 billion. This is a category of agencies associated with this cause. However, it is fair to say that she is someone with tremendous power and influence and basically a bottomless budget to work with.
I don't know if it's worth us talking about communism because it just has such a bad rap.
Well, because it's failed every time. That's why it has a bad
But
rap.
so has capitalism.
It's very tempting to respond to this sort of self-righteous ignorance by immediately pointing to the human casualties of communism, by pointing to the proverbial millions of corpses, the huge piles of skulls, for example, here in Cambodia. I don't understand how it's possible in the year 2020 for an influential, highly educated, highly funded political leader like Patrisse Cullors to be so insensitive. I just don't understand it. And, it wasn't just Cambodia's tragedy. It was the whole world's tragedy. I understand her political position. I grew up in a family where the majority of people around me were Marxists and were even hardcore communists, not just my parents, but aunts and uncles and people like that. I have grown up surrounded by people with this mentality, people who are willing to commit to making these excuses for mass murder. But couldn't you have some sensitivity? Couldn't you have some compassion? Couldn't you have some human dignity when dealing with this issue? If that is your political position. But to take a step beyond these mind-boggling numbers, let's just talk about the kind of mediocre middle ground of communism for a moment. Right now, in the year 2020, would you be more excited about going to a university in Vietnam than you would be excited about going to a university in Japan? If I offered you a fully paid scholarship to get a PhD in Japan, you'd have to live in Japan for, let's say, 4 years, or a scholarship to get a PhD in Vietnam. Think for a minute. You can do some Google searches. If you were going to go spend 4 years of your life in Vietnam under communism today, under the unbelievably mild, diluted, mixed economy form of communism that exists today. Vietnam is now a hybrid of communism and capitalism. Still, you would be choosing to move to a very dangerous place where you have no freedom of speech, where you have none of the civil rights or political rights you take for granted in Japan or South Korea. How about Cuba? Would you be excited at the prospect of going to get a university degree in Cuba even now, even today? And how would you have felt in, say, the 1950s? Back when communism was really murdering all these people, back when communism was in its much more repressive, much more authoritarian phase. How would you have felt about devoting 4 years of your life to living in Russia, to living in communist China, to living in a place where you had none of the freedoms and none of the civil rights that you can take for granted in the Western world? How would you feel about the difference between living in East Germany versus West Germany under communism? Or still today, how would you feel about the difference between living in North Korea and living in South Korea? And right now, let's be honest, In North Korea, as bad as it is, there are no piles of skulls like this. No, Patrice. There's a really meaningful sense in which communism has been a failure. And you can't just turn around and say that capitalism equally has been a failure. That's just not true.
We can't allow for fear to dictate how we understand what's possible. You want to know a funny fact? Everybody called Dr. Martin Luther King a communist.